was surprised by it, I guess, as a lot of people are who don't know going in what to expect. I like the leads very much. I think that's much of the talk about the film has been the chemistry of your two female leads. Let's talk a little bit about the novel this comes from. What attracted you to that novel in the first place?
I was mainly attracted by the central character, Mona, and her voice. You know, the whole story is told in her voice, in first person. And I like this, you know, her thought processes and her take on things. You know, this mixture of kind of cynicism, naivety, wit, and rebellion. Above all, she was very witty, and she had a soul. She had a yearning for something. So I thought, you know, it's very rare to find these sort of characters in nature nowadays. You know, when you find them in a novel, why not take them? So I liked her, and I liked the relationship with Tamsin. It felt very. It was very well done in the novel. You know, it felt very authentic, and it was sort of very layered. You know, there were many twists and turns in it, and it worked on many levels. So I liked that a lot. What was also there in the novel was a lot of other characters, and it was a very kind of sociologically very specific place and time. It was set in 1984 and during miners' strike, and the pub was full of miners. It was a kind of lively northern pub. You know, Mona had a father, sister, stepmother, another stepmother, and it was full of characters, and it was very plotty. There were a lot of twists and turns that I didn't fully believed in them because they were fun. It told funnily in Mona's voice, but you know, but if you put them on screen, they wouldn't quite ring true. So I basically stripped everything away. Also, I wasn't terribly interested in sort of realistic portrayal of sociological portrayal of Britain. I was most interested in characters with some kind of, you know, passion, craving, interest in something that's beyond them. And these two girls were really strong on that front. And then I invented the character of the born-again Christian brother for Mona, you know, to put her character and her temperament in a slightly different context. And I sort of replotted the whole story with these three elements. And I turned this sort of this kind of sociologically precise England into something rather more kind of elemental, abstract almost, and removed from recognizable Britain of today.
How much of the girls' physical, emotional, and quote erotic relationship comes from the book, and how many changes went through that?
I think in the book it's more or less the same. You know, all the elements in their relationship are. I mean, I've sort of changed the order of things, you know, but all the layers are there in the book, you know, and it all feels very very, very, very authentic, you know. I mean, they're fascinated with each other. Well, especially Mona is fascinated with Tamsin, with Tamsin's sort of world, you know, this sort of this kind of different, exotic new world, and all of Tamsin's fictions work on Mona. Of course, the fictions in the book were different from the fictions I kind of introduced. You know, there was no Edith Piaf or any of that stuff. And also Tamsin was sort of vaguely tickled by Mona's kind of, you know, tomboy urchin-like kind of presence, and her, sort of, she supposed, you know, criminal life on the estate. You know, they both presented two different fictions to each other, and they were both prepared to be taken for a ride in a way. But they're also fascinated, well, especially Mona is fascinated by the kind of quality of Tamsin, not just her mind and her culture, but also her body. She, you know, Tamsin seemed to be made of better material or something. You know, it's like it's a different sort of creature, you know, made in a different factory. So there was that, which is fascinating too. You know, it was all there in the novel, but it was, you know, it was surrounded by all sorts of other stuff. You know, Tamsin's father and mother were around, and there was a policeman, there was a serial killer, there was a, you know, pedophile. There was also, you know, cast of many.
Watching the film, I thought that it might have existed for that one shot of the cross being carried through the hills of Yorkshire, those green hills, and that cross being carried along by the brother's new friends, the Christian cult that he's a part of. I thought that the film itself might have almost sprung from the imagination of what it would look like to carry that cross through that countryside.
Well, Well, it didn't spring from that, but I had that shot in mind for many years because I once tried to make a documentary about an evangelist preacher in Lancashire, not far from where we were filming, who had the plan to carry a 20-meter cross to the top of Pendle Hill, which he claimed was a magnet for all sorts of evils in the area. Pendle Hill was a mountain where 300 years ago some witches had been hanged, and supposedly it still attracts witchcraft and Satanism. And this evangelist preacher used that to mobilize his flock into action. And 15 years ago, I tried to make a documentary about him, but he never got permission to plant this cross on top of the hill because the local council just wouldn't give him permission. They claimed that a cross on top of a hill would constitute a new development, as they called it. So my film bit the dust, but I kept the image which I hoped to get. I kept it and recycled it later.
What do you like about those Christians? I mean, they're not dealt with in a strictly realistic way. We most see them speaking in tongues, falling about. We see them in an emotional state. We don't see them in a strictly realistic state. But what is it you liked about them that would play off against what the girls were going through?
I wasn't terribly interested in them as such, and I think it's quite realistic. I mean, I observed their activities for a while researching this whole strand in the film. And Paddy Considine, who plays Phil, spent some time with them. It's pretty realistic, but I didn't foreground them. They were just a backdrop to Phil's character. And Phil was, the character that interested me. I didn't deal with a theme of born again Christianity as such. I was just, creating a character who's just got faith recently, whose faith is very fragile, and that's why he's sort of quite kind of rhetorical and kind of hysterical about it. And but it's clearly fragile, and it was sort of about his character and his journey, And I was interested to create a brother for Mona, who's in some ways similar temperamentally to her, who's quite kind of who's ready to plunge into things, and who needs some kind of major change, and who needs to lose himself in something bigger than himself. But then it's also a story of a kind of, fascination and disenchantment, and it works for Mona and it works for Phil, her brother.
I gather you think that contemporary England, outside of swinging London and all the hip-hop culture, is sort of depressed and sort of searching for identity.
I find swinging London even more depressing than anywhere outside. I don't know. That's more what the film is about. I'm just kind of, I don't know how far England's swinging. I mean, it is supposed to be a kind of boom period. Economy is booming. Everyone's sort of theoretically doing well, but it's a very depressed society, which is kind of quite. There's not much going on a kind of emotional front in England. It's a miserable time, in fact. Or maybe I'm just a miserable person. That's why I see it as miserable. But no, but it's not a representation of England as such, England as it is today necessarily. I tried to make something slightly more, timeless or universal. But it's very much England in some ways because that landscape is so very English. That Yorkshire. I mean, I've tried to photograph it in a kind of unusual way, but that mixture of nature and the post-industrial decay. So close together, overlapping. In fact, it's very very English, and also the idea of two girls living within a mile of each other whose minds are in completely different worlds. Who imagine the world so differently. I don't think you'd find any other country in Europe where where you could. That sort of gulf could exist. So I try to deal with kind of more universal things, more kind of bigger emotions than the emotions you actually encounter in everyday life in England today.
For the paper, I should ask, these two girls are clearly not lesbians the way we think of them, because there's now a culture around that and everything. Why do you think the sexual part of it proceeds as it does? Who do you think is driving that aspect of it? Because it's an integral part of the relationship, and yet it's not in any way a lesbian relationship. So where do you think that comes from?
I think they just spend a lot of time together. They observe each other. They just rub against each other, so to speak, and it's hot, and and they're kind of fascinated by each other, and Mona is definitely fascinated by Tamsin being so different, made of a different material. This there's something that that leads them to get closer and closer and experiment with each other. I don't know the science of it all, they're lesbian or not. I kind of leave it to the viewers, but they're just fascinated with each other, and I like the fact that they're fascinated on so many different levels. And who drives it, I don't know. The first kiss, it just sort of, it's a sort of moment where they're both on the same wavelength for some reason. But it's a film, which is quite kind of ambiguous, slippery, and and open. It's not kind of scientifically written. It's not like a who drives what scene exactly at this present moment. What line explains the motivation. I like films which operate on a slightly more kind of ambiguous, open, poetic way. And which feel real because you create. You sculpt a moment that feels real and that is somehow expressive. But I wouldn't want to analyze it.
In some ways, Mona and her brother are like both involved in a simultaneous but very different rapture. They're both overcome by something in a kind of overwhelming spiritual, religious kind of way.
Yes, it's a film about rapture and about disenchantment. I think possibly Mona emerges stronger from the whole thing. Whereas Phil is left with very little. But they're kind of similar characters, the brother and sister. That's why they kind of there's a kind of implicit love affair between them, or love, not love affair. But part of Mona's sort of drama at the beginning is that she lost her brother, a brother who meant a lot to her, and that's one of the reasons why she seeks, some other new thing that'll inspire her and take her somewhere where she hasn't been before.
You're from Central Europe, right? Is it Poland? Talk a little bit about how you come to England in the first place, because you bring a very Central European film sensibility to England. How's that come about?
Well, I came when I was 15, so I can't claim that my artistic development happened in Central Europe, but I definitely, have a kind of outsider's position in England. I don't have to have it, but I like being an outsider. Of course, when I came at the age of 15, I didn't speak a word of English. I spent a year practically in silence. I couldn't communicate with anyone. I was just kind of observing, trying to understand the rules of the game. And the rules of the game in England are very peculiar. It's a very strange country. A lot is left unsaid where the codes are unwritten. Everything works through understatement, and there's a lot of ambiguity in human relations. So I found that really interesting from outside, and I kept that perspective, I suppose, But then I went to live in other countries where, again, I didn't speak the language, and I kind of tried to learn the ropes as best I could, So that kind of being outside is something I'm kind of familiar with from experience. But I think, my sensibility is also shaped by the movies that I liked, There's a kind of canon of great filmmakers and films and great art, and not just film. I'm inspired by a certain type of art, and that's probably more influences the way I make films than my personal experiences.
How did you come to Britain? What was the
Well, my mother married an Englishman and dragged me with her to England, and I didn't have much say in it, to be honest. My parents were divorced. My father fled from Poland separately, and then, interestingly enough, my parents met abroad and remarried later. But I came to London at 15, and I went to live in Germany for a couple of years, in Italy. But London was the place where I kind of felt most at home, and that's why I ended up being there.
I learned through talking to my mother recently that something like that, akin to that, almost happened to me at 14 when my father suddenly died. He was English, as it turns out. And I think back, I could have had an entirely different life. The life I'm now living would have been ripped out, and I never would have known it. Well, how traumatic was it for you to leave the life, and what was your life in Poland that you left to come to England? Was there any trauma involved in that?
Yeah, in the sudden departure, it was quite traumatic, and also being plunged into a world which you can't understand. My life in Poland was great. I was growing up, under communism, but communism didn't affect children that much. In fact, living in a police state gives you fantastic freedom to just do whatever you want. We roam around the streets and spend whole days, just hanging around in Warsaw at various places. I had a good, happy childhood, and I grew up in a kind of collective environment. Everything I learned in the courtyard of my tower block, and it was great. I miss that. I miss that sort of a life where you actually learn from people around you, where people bring stuff to the courtyard, and kind of share their experience, and you can fall in love with somebody or have a fight with somebody. In sort of contemporary Western societies, everything is just compartmentalized. Everybody gets transported somewhere, and people experience life mainly through television. They experience emotions and they find out about things from the media rather than through some kind of interaction with fellow human beings. So I miss that, and plus I had a girlfriend at the time, had mates. Suddenly I end up in London with nothing. We were quite poor as well. It was quite a shock. At the same time, London was a fascinating place. It was though I didn't understand what's going on. It was just a fantastic kind of new universe. A jungle where you could explore all sorts of nooks and crannies. And I kind of fell in love with London. On the other hand, as an outsider would.
Now, one of the films you made, which I haven't seen, The Last Resort, kind of draws on an experience like that, where a family is uprooted, comes to England for one set of reasons, and winds up being kind of held hostage for another set of reasons.
Yeah. There's a sort of bit of autobiography in that one, although it's a very different sort of story. It was a film. It's about a Russian woman, who comes over with her son. And sort of, well, she comes because she thinks she's getting married to this English guy who doesn't turn up at the airport. So she stupidly, instinctively asks for political asylum as a way of staying, and she gets shunted to this bizarre, slightly abstract, I must admit, universe on the seaside, and she can't get out of there. But she meets some people who start meaning something to her. But it was interpreted as a film about immigration, but it was never meant to be that. It was precisely about the kind of mother and son relationship, quite a complicated one, and about being in a place where where you don't understand the rules, and trying to find a sort of humanity and warmth in a place, where both these things are kind of a rare commodity. But it's quite autobiographic. Yeah.
What was it like to fall in love in England for the first time, and what was it like to fall in love with what you were going to do with your life with filmmaking? Yeah. Talk about how those two came about.
Falling in love? Oh God, that's a long time ago. But well, let's talk about filmmaking. It's easier. Well, I was always, always loved films ever since I was a kid. But at a certain point in my life, I got more and more interested in literature, especially in poetry. And I was writing some, and I was writing I studied poetry, and I started writing a PhD on a particular poet that I really liked, Georg Trakl, an Austrian expressionist. And while doing this PhD in Oxford, I kind of realized that I'm not going to be an academic. I'm not going to be a poet either, because I can't write in Polish, given that I couldn't return to Poland, and English was my mother tongue. So I started. One of the things I started doing was started studying photography and joined a filmmakers workshop and started making these sort of short poetic films, which then got me an in at the BBC, where they were looking for young directors. So I got a stint in a documentary department of the BBC, and then I made a couple of films that were quite successful. I won a few awards, and then I got a kind of license to make whatever films I wanted for about 3 or 4 years, or 5 years, and I just made documentaries after my own taste, after my own fashion, and created a very particular sort of type of documentary filmmaking. And then by then I was totally, filmmaking was my passion, and it stayed like that.
The BBC is a kind of singular organization, isn't it? It really does. It functions in a way that almost nothing else in the world does.
Not anymore. That was late 80s to mid 90s. It was a kind of funny state-owned enterprise. With sort of enclaves of independent filmmaking. It was a bit like a film school in a way. There are these sort of departments where young filmmakers came and tried things out, and ratings were not an issue. And all sorts of eccentric commissioning editors, had the license to try things out, and I was lucky enough to be making films at that time. In mid '90s, BBC was reorganized, and turned into this sort of corporation like every other TV station in the world, and vertically kind of ruled like a pyramid, So these little pockets of autonomy disappeared, and everything becomes part of some kind of overall strategy of the channel. So that your idea of BBC is no longer valid. But the interesting thing is that so many filmmakers in Britain actually started making films at the BBC, even without having gone to film school, and they had the kind of license to try things out, to fail, and there's a whole batch of very interesting filmmakers who started that way. So BBC, was very influential in shaping, British culture at some point.
Where does the Edith Piaf come? Because I used Edith Piaf in one of my short films, and I love it. And it's very right for what Ramona is at the film in that point. But where does it come from for you?
Well, that particular song I just love, and I remember hearing it from some clochard woman singing in Paris. She was singing it in Paris in the late 70s when I was living in Paris. And that song always stayed with me. And I've got a repertoire of songs and motifs, that I kind of keep in my back pocket, for the right moment. And when I was writing this story, I thought that, Edith Piaf, this particular song, which, La Foule, that was really good for Tamsin's character, and all that kind of nonsense story about Edith Piaf's murdering her husband. It was kind of good character-defining mad monologue. That was good for Tamsin, and the song was sort of there's a kind of vitality about it, and kind of throwing everything to the to the elements and letting yourself go. Which just felt very relevant to this film.
Finally, how do you know that when the girls have the chemistry, which they clearly have? At what moment do you see that when they're physically together, and they're not very experienced as actors, so that you really, that chemistry is crucial. It's one of the few things that you really have. Well, how do you know that?
You mean with the actors?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was doing, I was casting for a long time, and I was casting when I knew I had to cast right, and with every film I actually spend a lot of time casting. It's absolutely key to find, like an actor who can inhabit the character and who has the character in them somewhere. You can't act stuff that you don't somehow have in you. So I was first. I found Natalie Press, who plays Mona, and that was the kind of that was the basis. And then I was testing all sorts of other actresses, in screen tests with Natalie. And when we came across Emily Blunt, they just felt very right. That we actually I tested them with a scene with this Edith Piaf scene, which is quite a kind of key scene in the film, and they were great. Immediately, there was a spark. They looked right together, although partly because they're very different. They're very different, physically very different, and mentally very different. One kind of quite inward and intense, the other one more kind of confident and kind of theatrical in a good way. So they just felt right. But you need to do screen tests. There's no way you can just kind of judge from looking at them. But and screen tests were great, possibly better than the film.
What's the scene that's your favorite scene in the film? What works best for you that really says what the film is about?
Probably that scene with Edith Piaf, when they dance together for the first time, and the seduction scene, between Phil and Tamsin. These are the kind of dramatically defining scenes. There's several others, but there are a lot of funny scenes I like. I like when Mona impersonates a man in bed. It's quite funny. She basically kind of pretends she's Ricky, her boyfriend. There's a lot of scenes I like. I quite like this film.